In the autumn of 1347, a small fleet of trading ships drifted into the harbor of Messina on the island of Sicily. The people who gathered at the docks to greet them quickly wished they hadn't. Most of the sailors aboard were already dead. The few still breathing were barely alive, burning with fever, their bodies covered in black swellings that oozed blood. The horrified port authorities ordered the ships back out to sea, but it was already too late. Whatever had killed those sailors was no longer confined to the ships. It had stepped onto the docks, and it was about to kill 1 out of every 3 people on an entire continent. To understand how a handful of ships could trigger the deadliest disaster in recorded history, we have to follow the thing that hid inside them, all the way back to where it began. The killer was a bacterium, known today as Yersinia pestis. On its own, it was almost helpless. It couldn't travel far, and it couldn't jump easily from person to person. What it needed was a ride. And it found the perfect one in the fleas that lived on rodents. When an infected flea bit a human, it injected the bacteria directly into the body. And from there, the disease did its terrible work with astonishing speed. Within days, the lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck would swell into painful lumps the size of eggs. These swellings, called buboes, gave the disease one of its names: the bubonic plague. The skin around them often darkened as the tissue beneath died, which is part of why later generations would call the whole catastrophe the Black Death. For centuries, this bacterium had lived quietly in the wild rodent populations of Central Asia, flaring up only occasionally. But sometime in the early 14th century, it began to spread in a way it never had before. Carried westward along the vast network of trade routes that connected China and Central Asia to the markets of Europe. The same roads that carried silk, spices, and grain now carried something invisible and lethal. The plague's leap into Europe came at a place called Kaffa, a bustling port on the Crimean coast of the Black Sea, controlled by merchants from the Italian city of Genoa. In 1346, Kaffa found itself under siege by a Mongol army of the Golden Horde. But the besiegers had a problem of their own. The plague had reached their camp, and their soldiers were dying in droves. According to a chronicle written shortly afterward, the Mongol commanders, watching their army collapse, made a grim decision. They loaded the bodies of their plague victims onto catapults and hurled the corpses over the city walls. Historians still debate how much of this dramatic story is literally true, but the broader point holds. Whether through corpses flung over walls or through the fleas and rats that move with any army, the plague got inside Kaffa. And when the Genoese defenders finally fled the doomed city in their ships, sailing home toward Italy, they carried the disease with them into the heart of the Mediterranean. Those were the ships that arrived at Messina. From Sicily, the plague spread with a speed that defied all understanding. It reached the Italian mainland, then southern France and Spain. By 1348, it had taken hold in Paris and crossed the sea to England. By 1350, it had pushed north into Scotland and Scandinavia. In barely 4 years, it swept across the entire continent, and almost no place was spared. What made it so unstoppable was that the people living through it had no idea what they were fighting. The idea that tiny living organisms could cause disease was still centuries away. To the people of the 14th century, the plague seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some believed it was poisoned air, a foul invisible mist that hung over the cities. Others were certain it was divine punishment, the wrath of God unleashed on a sinful world. The most learned physicians of the age studied the alignment of the planets, convinced the stars held the answer. None of them were looking at fleas. This blindness made everything worse. People fled infected cities, and in fleeing, carried the disease to the countryside. They gathered in churches to pray for deliverance, packing themselves into exactly the crowded conditions where the plague spread fastest. And there was a second, even deadlier form of the disease that didn't need fleas at all. When the bacteria reached the lungs, it became pneumonic plague, which could spread directly from one person to another through a single cough. This version killed almost everyone it touched, and it killed them fast, sometimes within a day or two.
The scale of the dying was difficult to comprehend, both then and now. Across Europe, the plague is estimated to have killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population, with the total death toll often placed at around 25 million people on the continent alone, and tens of millions more across Asia and the Middle East. Some cities lost more than half their inhabitants. Entire villages simply ceased to exist, their fields left to grow wild because there was no one left alive to work them. Contemporary writers described streets full of the dead, mass graves dug to hold bodies that no one had time to mourn, and a silence settling over towns that had once been full of life. In the face of such horror, people searched desperately for someone to blame, and as fear curdled into cruelty, that search turned monstrous. Across parts of Europe, rumors spread that the plague was no accident, that it had been deliberately caused by poisoning the wells. Jewish communities became the target of these lies, and waves of horrifying violence followed. Thousands of Jews were murdered in massacres across the German lands and beyond, accused of a crime that had never happened, while the true cause of the plague continued its work unnoticed and unchecked. Others turned their fear inward. Bands of people known as flagellants traveled from town to town, whipping their own bodies bloody in public, hoping that by punishing themselves they might persuade God to lift the curse. Crowds gathered to watch them, drawn by the same desperation that drove the flagellants forward. It changed nothing. The plague burned on until, around 1351, it finally began to fade. Not because anyone had defeated it, but because it had run out of new victims to infect in those first devastating years. But the world it left behind was not the same world it had entered, and here lies one of the strangest truths about the Black Death. Out of so much death came profound and lasting change. Before the plague, much of Europe ran on a rigid system in which vast numbers of peasants worked the land for powerful lords, with little freedom and little hope of anything more. Labor was cheap because people were plentiful. Then, suddenly, people were not plentiful at all. With so many workers dead, the survivors discovered that their labor had become precious. Peasants who had once been bound to the land could now demand higher wages, or simply leave to find a lord who would pay more. The old chains of the feudal order, which had held for centuries, began to loosen and break. Wages rose, ordinary people gained a bargaining power they had never possessed. The catastrophe reshaped minds as much as it reshaped economies. The church, which had promised protection and prayer, had been powerless to stop the dying, and many people's faith in its authority was shaken. A world that had seemed fixed and eternal had been revealed as fragile. In the decades that followed, that sense of a world remade would help feed the extraordinary burst of art, learning, and human ambition that we now call the Renaissance. The bacterium itself never truly disappeared. It struck Europe again and again over the following centuries, including the Great Plague of London more than 300 years later. Even today, Yersinia pestis still lives quietly in rodent populations on several continents, causing a small number of cases each year, though modern antibiotics now make it treatable when caught in time. The Black Death remains the deadliest pandemic ever recorded by the proportion of people it killed. It was carried not by armies or conquerors, but by something small enough to hide in the fur of a rat, riding the same trade routes that had been built to spread wealth and knowledge. It reminds us how deeply connected the world already was, centuries before anyone used that word. And it stands as a haunting lesson in what happens when a threat arrives that no one can see, no one understands, and no one knows how to stop, until it has already changed everything.